Yep, I'm on. So good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Global Development. My name is Scott Morris. I'm a senior fellow here. I also direct something called the U.S. Development Policy Initiative, which gives me the credentials to host such an illustrious panel on a topic that is focused on U.S. policy, an important area of U.S. policy. We saw in recent months a number of statements from the president himself, from Ambassador Haley, that put today's topic sort of not only on the radar but as a priority issue. The question of the foreign aid the U.S. gives to countries in the world and the positions they take in voting within the UN, whether they are voting in alignment with U.S. interests and votes or against them. Just to give you a few of these statements so that we understand how the issue has been framed by the administration. The State of the Union address this year included this statement from the president. He urged Congress to pass legislation to help ensure American foreign assistance dollars always serve American interests and only go to America's friends. So there's a broad statement of policy. From Ambassador Haley then in March, we hear President Trump and I are pushing to draw a closer connection between U.S. foreign aid and how countries vote at the UN. And then it's certainly worth noting that the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, has a record of views in this area, and he's said in the past, I've been of the view that votes in the United Nations should cost countries that vote against us. So we're going to explore that question here today. We have a range of views represented, a range of experiences, all high quality experiences. I will say I'm really excited actually about the panelists that we have. We want to sort of test the basic proposition. Is this a good idea? Does it make sense? What's the case for it? Some are going to make a case for it. Others, the opposite, really do not think it's a good idea. So we want to explore that. And then really go beyond that to figure out what it's going to look like operationally. How do you go forward with a policy like this? We will spend most of the time in discussion up here. I will pose questions, encourage our panelists to interact with each other, and then time permitting toward the end, you'll have the opportunity to ask some questions. So let me introduce our panelists. I think I have you in alphabetical order, so we're going to do that to cause no offense to anyone. But let's start with Christopher Burnham down here at the end, who is currently chairman of Cambridge Global Advisors, has had stints in the private sector, in other private sector roles with Deutsche Bank significantly, but for our purposes today, has a distinguished career as a public servant, serving both in the UN system at a very senior level, but also in the State Department during the Bush administration. Next to Chris Sheba Crocker, also former senior State Department official in the Obama administration, and is currently Vice President for Humanitarian Programs and Policy at CARE. Sarah Rose, my colleague here at the center, is a policy fellow, and in fact, I would say is the mastermind of this panel today. She wrote a policy brief that brought some analysis to the question a number of months ago, which really inspired us to think about bringing together a range of views in a setting like this. So thank you, Sarah. Sorry, I'm turning my pages. So Brett Schaefer is the J. Kingham Fellow in International Regulatory Affairs at the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. I would say that Brett is a longtime UN watcher, analyst, critic, and significantly I would point to the 2009 book that he edited, Conundrum, The Limits of the United Nations and the Search for Alternatives. and we'll come back to Brett first, actually, because I would say he has been on record well before this administration on this issue and making the case for linking U.S. aid and UN votes. And last but not least, Jessica Trisco-Darden, who's the Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, which is, as you were describing before we came in, sounds like a really nice gig because it gives you a break from your teaching at American University, but also has delved in and brought some very interesting analysis to the question of this linkage. And so look forward to hearing your views from an analytical perspective. So, as I said, Brett, we'd like to start with you. Give us the case. I mean, the case that you've made, why it's important to make this linkage, and then maybe a little bit about how you see it in practice. So, is there anything in terms of what this administration has said or already done that you think is consistent with what you would like to see as a departure? And just help us flesh it out a little bit to begin.
Sure. Thanks for having me here today. It's great to be here, and I'm glad the crowd's here and for this event. I guess the first point that I would like to make is that this is not a new issue. This is something that has extended back decades now. The first real mention of this, I think, was by Senator Moynihan when he was representative at the UN. And he made the point that too often the United States goes to the UN General Assembly, and we're content with losing there. And we come back and we console ourselves with the fact that we accomplished some tweak on this, or we managed to moderate the language in a way that wasn't quite as bad as it was before. But that this ultimately was unsuccessful, that this was a losing strategy, and the United States needed to be far more aggressive in trying to shift minds and shift opinions among the other nations in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, in ECOSOC, and other parts of the UN system, to move them more closely into the U.S. opinion on policies in a host of different areas. When Jean Kirkpatrick became ambassador at the UN under the Reagan administration, she also took a look around the General Assembly, took a look around the ECOSOC, took a look around at how the other member states were behaving, many of whom were large recipients of U.S. foreign assistance. And she also was just disappointed, I guess, that countries that would side with the United States politically outside of New York or outside of Geneva would not be our partners and would not be supporting us to the same extent in New York. And she went to Congress and she testified in 1983. And in that testimony, she provided the very first comprehensive look at the votes that the member states were taking in the UN General Assembly, how they were voting in coordination or in coincidence with the United States, broke it down by regional groups, broke it down by ideological groups, and showed that countries that were receiving large amounts of U.S. assistance were voting against the United States. And this was not, that in essence, the United States was not applying its aid in a way to effectively shift the balance or the center of gravity in the UN General Assembly in our direction on policy decisions in the UN General Assembly. So Congress adopted legislation in the 80s mandating that the State Department produce a report every year on UN voting in the General Assembly. They also, at that time, required the U.S. State Department and USAID to take into account UN voting in aid allocation decisions. So what does that mean? What does take into account UN voting? It's not dispositive. It's not the overriding factor. It's not even a key decision or a key factor. It was just something to be taken into account at that time. And it makes sense, because why does the United States provide assistance? Fundamentally, we provide assistance to advance our interests. And those interests are very broad, probably more broad for the United States than any other country in the world. Those interests include humanitarian assistance, aiding countries in distress, populations in distress. We do that for moral and ethical reasons, but we also do it for practical reasons. We do it because refugees may cause problems if they try and flee the area of their distress, and you want to help them out as close to the area where they originated as possible to facilitate their return to where they were before. Countries in distress may become unstable, and unstable countries can be vulnerable to terrorism and other adversarial outcomes that the United States doesn't want to see. We provide security assistance to our allies to support them both materially, but also with weapons and other military assistance, professionalize their armed forces to try and increase the standards and the observance of human rights by their armed forces, to bolster our security and our alliances abroad. We provide assistance for development with the idea that countries that are with higher per capita incomes are going to be future trading partners and economic partners to the United States. We also provide assistance for foreign policy reasons, and that's really what we're talking about here. How does the United States advance foreign policy within the United Nations, outside of it? And it's absolutely legitimate for the United States to go to the UN and use what leverage it has, diplomatic influence and financial influence, to try and advance its foreign policy outcomes to the extent possible, because that's in our interests. And we have an obligation to use that assistance effectively. This is taxpayer dollars. We're taking money from the pockets of our citizens and we're sending it abroad. And we have an obligation to do so to the benefit of our citizens. And one of those benefits has to be advancing our foreign policy priorities. So how effective has the U.S. been at doing this? And over the past week or so, I was looking at different studies that have been done linking aid and UN voting. Some of them have found that there really isn't a coincidence or any kind of real relationship or a significant relationship between the two. Some of them have found that there is a significant relationship between the two. And those ones I'm kind of curious about, because I also, over the past week, have spoken to individuals that were there in the Reagan administration, the first Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the second Bush administration, and the Obama administration. People that were in the NSC, people that were in the State Department, people that were USAID, people that were UN. And the conclusion that all of them told me is that the U.S. never really consistently applied this policy in any shape or form to countries. It was the very, very rare exception for the United States to actually approach another perm rep or approach another capital and say, this vote is important to us, and your failure to side with us on this is going to affect our bilateral relationship in terms of foreign assistance. That was extraordinarily rare in their experience. And so we don't really have, according to the testimony and according to the experience of these officials, a case where the United States has consistently applied this policy. So the finding of a causal relationship somehow between UN voting and the application of assistance is curious based on their experiences. So it's interesting. And I wonder whether we are actually witnessing a fact that our friends tend to get more aid than our not friends do. And this may be a side effect that we're seeing in the General Assembly because our friends tend to vote with us more often than our adversaries do. So that's a curious thing as well. But I also want to step back and return to the fact about taking the UN voting into account in terms of aid allocation. That provision or that instruction was repealed in the early 1990s, so we haven't had that in place for basically 2 decades, almost 3 decades now. So to the extent that it's even an instruction, or was an instruction influencing U.S. decision-making, it certainly isn't in place right now in terms of law, which is, in my opinion, a gross oversight. If you take a look at the foreign aid programs, I would struggle to find something that is more programmed by Congress than the foreign aid programs. Oxfam put together a list of legislative instructions for foreign aid, In 2009, it was almost 400 different legislative instructions. I was talking to a USAID official the other day. Over 90% of their money is programmed, meaning that we don't have the flexibility necessary to link it to UN voting, even if we wanted to, for most cases. So I find it interesting that among all those 400 different legislative instructions, including some dozen or so that are actually targeted at the UN in some way, shape, or form, in terms of supporting what UN wants to do and UN objectives of UNICEF and so forth, that we wouldn't have one that was targeted at looking at trying to influence UN voting. And not every UN resolution is important. Some of them, frankly, are completely unimportant, like UN or the World Bicycle Day, or a resolution that was passed by unanimous consent last year. But some of them are. A handful every year are important, and we want to influence those. And I think we should be using the tools necessary, diplomacy, foreign assistance, everything on our toolkit necessary to make those votes shift in our direction. Thank you.
I'm struggling not to take offense as a biker to work, but I don't know the details of the resolutions. Well, that's great. So I think, so Brett, we have from you, among your remarks, a broad statement of principle here around the legitimate use of aid in the toolkit in pursuit of our foreign policy objectives. And then a characterization that in practice it just hasn't been used. So I want to turn to our policymakers to explore that a little bit, particularly from their experiences. And Sheba, I'll start with you. You should feel free, by the way, to respond to anything you heard from Brett, but I would like to hear from your experience. You were Assistant Secretary for International Organizations, so really direct responsibilities and interest in the UN system and the pursuit of US foreign policy interests for the UN. So how did this direct question ever arise? How did you look at it? How do you view it in the context of the tools that are available to you as a policymaker?
So, I mean, I will just also reiterate, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here today. And you know, I may pick up on a few of the points that Brett made, but just to maybe come back a bit and think about when I was in my office or in offices around the world, pushing other member states about votes that the U.S. really cared about. And I think I can just confirm the general proposition that as a general matter, withholding, holding out the threat of withholding foreign assistance in response to how a country voted on a particular issue was not something that was normally in my talking points. But that is not to say that we did not make every effort to push countries to vote in certain ways on issues that the U.S. really cared about. And I think it goes without question, or at least it should go without question, that any of us who were engaged in diplomacy around UN votes in the various fora that Brett mentioned and others was always doing that with a view to pursuing, to the best degree that we could, U.S. national interest in any particular thing. I mean, I think Brett is exactly right that a lot of votes that happen at the UN and a lot of things, by the way, never get voted, as we know, too. So I think it's important always to step back and recognize that even if you're just looking at the General Assembly, if you have, say, 100 votes in a year, maybe 12, 13, 14 of those, 15, somewhere in there, would be classified as important to the United States. And many things just don't get voted. They go through by consensus, and you can weigh that in different ways. You can say, well, I'm not going to count that because that was consensus, or you can view it as a sign that in the vast majority of cases, the U.S. is more or less aligned with other countries around the world and how resolutions are going through, whether voting or otherwise. But I think it really obviously is then honing in on those handful or plus that are considered by the U.S. to be important. And there I think it's also pretty relevant probably to talk about the general range of issues that those votes tend to occur on every year. And so to be a little bit honest about what we're really talking about, which is in large part votes related to Israeli-Palestinian issues in the General Assembly, and then some other very important issues, including on, I think, weapons of mass destruction. And if you look at that, especially the first category, I think what you would find is that the U.S. is very isolated. And so the notion of holding out a threat to withhold assistance to change those votes I think is just a very broad brush approach to an issue where since the founding of the United Nations, the US has been incredibly isolated. I think, Brett, although I don't know because I haven't done the research, but I would expect that when you're hearing from people that there is in certain cases correlation between the giving of foreign assistance and votes, that it would actually correlate almost exactly, if not exactly, with that list of countries that traditionally votes with the US on Israel-Palestine issues at the UN. So that small range of countries where we can sort of count on those votes sort of reliably. And so I think that's a test case, but that's also a much smaller piece of the pie in terms of the amount of assistance that is given historically to those countries year in, year out, which, I think the shorthand has always been like, well, that's to buy votes in the UN system, and it's those votes that we care about, right? It's not the way that we normally view, and I think Brett, framed this very well, that normally, obviously, when we're thinking about why we provide assistance, it's for an enormous range of issues, and I think we have to always be careful about how we balance the importance of any particular UN vote in that regard. It's true that the US is fairly isolated on a small subset of votes at the General Assembly every year. It's also true that we have, since the founding of the UN, otherwise held an incredibly privileged position at the UN across the board, and on things that are deeply important to the United States on issues of international peace and security, for example. We've obviously held the privileged position of being a permanent five member and being able to wield a particular kind of power across the system. And I think that's important because it's always important to remember kind of the position that puts us in as the United States when we're walking into any kind of room to push in one way or another on UN votes. The P5, as we are known, are always treated differently in those kinds of conversations. And it enables us to push countries in different ways, diplomatically and otherwise. But it also means that it's important for us sometimes to just show up in good faith, put some skin in the game, and try to operate as a good actor across the system, and that means we're not always going to get everything that we want. So I guess what I'm saying in part is that I think we have to be careful not to find ourselves in a situation in which we're overcompensating on an issue where it's very hard for me anyway, unless something really breaks in this particular in the context of Israel and Palestine, both in the UN system and more broadly just with respect to that whole issue set. It's very hard to see a way forward in which the US doesn't continue to be as isolated as we have, and I think then you have to ask the question, given the range of other issues that we have on our plate, the broad interest that we're trying to push in any given situation, and the multiple purposes for which we're providing foreign assistance, whether we want to peg those decisions on and be a sort of single issue voter in that way. So I might just leave it there, but I can confirm that it was not something that I regularly raised, at least in that way. We obviously have sanctions as a tool at our disposal that we wield from time to time, generally not normally in response to how countries are voting in the UN General Assembly, but all of which is to say that I think spanning administrations, you've certainly seen the willingness to withhold foreign assistance depending on a particular issue. But I think it's fair to say not normally related to UN General Assembly votes, which, we have the International Day of Yoga and the International Day of the Bee and many other international days that are very important to many people around the world,
It's
but
the
are
biking
probably
I care
not
about.
things
The yoga
that are
going
to impact how we spend our foreign assistance dollars.
Great, and I do want to, I'd like to explore more how we situate very specifically the UN voting issue in the broader foreign policy context. You both addressed that. But Chris, let's turn to you. Broadly the same question, but I also want to note that you've approached this issue both as a U.S. policymaker, Undersecretary in the State Department, but also Undersecretary General in the UN system. So maybe a little bit of both perspectives. If there is a perspective of thinking about it on behalf of the UN, how you would think about this, but just more generally, drawing on your experience as a policymaker.
Well, thank you, Scott, and nice to be up here with you, former colleagues in some cases. I'm not here today to speak as a former international civil servant, Scott, or former Undersecretary General of the United Nations. I really want to address the issue of whether or not it should be, UN voting should be linked to development assistance. And even on a tangential basis, seeing Nikki Haley at the Heritage Foundation yesterday speaking about our resignation from the Human Rights Council, it's all related. There's a discussion we have to have, essentially, though, before we get into a discussion of should we be linking aid with their voting records, and that is, but what is development assistance today? In my opinion, development assistance and the world of how we interact with nations in terms of humanitarian assistance and development assistance is caught in a time warp. It's a time warp of 1965. I'm not sure we are delivering our aid well. I'm not sure we're delivering it in the best possible concepts of the 21st century. One of the things that Colin Powell brought into the State Department was the mission and bureau performance plans. We went through everything and forced our ambassadors and our representatives to develop 5 policy goals and 1 management goal. And they all actually came back to my office, and I reviewed those and then talked with each ambassador about exactly what your goals were going forward. And obviously we also did that with USAID. The world has changed not just because of how the global economy has changed, but also because we're now facing a world of one belt, one road. The Chinese are throwing almost $1 trillion over the last few years at development. I include, obviously, state-owned enterprises and capital investments and infrastructure investments in that. But it's a tremendous amount of money. Now, I was at a breakfast this morning where a former, very senior United States official called it the weaponization of aid, or weaponization of development. I'm not going to go far as to say that, but I will say that it's expeditionary capitalism, the way we land a Marine expeditionary force on a beach every now and then. It's expeditionary capitalism on the part of the Chinese. They're landing capital, they're going in, they're taking over ports, they're bringing in their people, they're doing different things. And so the totality of how we manage that within the United States government has to be reviewed. And in fact, there's a bill in Congress right now that brings in everything from the Export-Import Bank to USAID and Millennium Challenge and PEPFAR and Trade Development Authority in some way to try and bring that kicking and screaming together in a mission-focused 21st century application. We have to redefine, just to get off the script here a little bit, Scott, we have to redefine what an ambassador is in the year 2025. We have to redefine what an embassy will look like in 2025. We have to redefine what we're going to be doing in a country in 2025, including all the missions that we do. What is an econ officer in 2025? Does an econ officer continue to do the traditional role of a foreign service officer of observe and report, which morphed over the last 50 years to observe and report and affect change or demarche or whatever? Why do I need an econ officer gathering information in Dar es Salaam when I have Bloomberg? And beyond Bloomberg, of course, the hedge funds that I know hire satellite companies to come tell you how many copper ships are leaving Santiago and how many fields of grain are growing in Belarus, all from LEO, low orbital satellites. So the mission is changing. And aid and development dollars has to change with it. We have to rethink how we're going to deploy that. In so doing, and linking it back to, in fact, coming back to the topic at hand, you know, Sarah did great work on her study within this organization on where our dollars go and how they're linked to how we're voting. And Brett, of course, at Heritage also did a fantastic paper on that. And you know, through Democrat and Republican administrations, and I think Sheba touched on this, we've linked aid to how you're voting. I can't remember who said it. It might have been Jimmy Baker, who, when Yemen voted against us in a critical vote, and he said that was the most expensive vote they're ever going to make.
one of the examples people could remember.
So of course we do that. When I was first Assistant Secretary at State, I was reviewing these business plans, I asked the question, who votes with us and what are the percentages? And Jim Kelly, Assistant Secretary for Asia, said Palau votes with us the most. They vote 95% of the time. And it is one nation, one vote, so Palau is equal to China or India or Russia. But suffice it to say that, we were tracking it 15 years ago and we ought to continue to track it. And just the way they've been doing for the last 4 or 5 presidencies in terms of linking these two together and using this as one of the tools, one of the arrows in your quiver to use to affect change at the United Nations, yes, it should most assuredly be one of those arrows, and we should be free to use it to help advance what I call the forward projection of foreign policy. In the military, we call it the forward projection of power. Well, I like to, having shifted from Pentagon to State Department, I like to call it the forward projection of foreign policy. How do we project our foreign policy across the world, which of course, as Brett already touched on today, civil society, democratic society, stable society, peace between you and your neighbors. There's an old expression, which I heard when I first got to the State Department, no democracy has ever had a famine. The reality is that we have to advance an agenda of good governance and anti-corruption and empowerment of women and stable society. And those things come as part of a United States vision for a better world. And so we have to modernize with that, particularly as we are facing new challenges of One Belt, One Road and other competition to the United States agenda of a better world.
Great, thank you, Chris. And my list of things to come back to is growing. You raised this and used the word competition, which I think is actually very salient. Obviously, as you said, in a much wider perspective, and the issue of China and Belt and Road. What I want to come back to is how to think about what the competitive effects are, particularly in the UN and UN voting. And frankly, for those of us in the development community, the language of recent decades is about development cooperation. It has not been about development competition, and I think it's hard for us to shift to thinking in a different way that, in a way, is returning to a much older mindset, but frankly may very well be the reality we're facing. So I want to come back to that as well. But let's round out this round with the folks who've actually done some research and analysis in this area. And so Jessica, I'll start with you. That was no slight, by the way.
I'll try not to be offended.
I'm measuring words on the page. I think your work has been, you've done some paper, Sarah, and you have done some papers in this area. Give me some reactions, what you view, both from the research you've done and what you've heard in terms of what is particularly salient in this issue, and as we think about what does a tighter, more aggressive linkage actually look like in practice, what are the implications of it? So your thoughts, please.
So I will begin by saying that I read papers that Brett had written on this issue while I was in grad school. So my analytical lens that I know, but we're all old, right? My concern is that this is not a bad idea, right? Foreign aid, in our usage of it, is inherently political. We're not talking about humanitarian assistance, and we know that military assistance is unlikely to be affected by such a policy. So we're really talking about the less than 50% of the foreign aid budget that is intended for political or foreign policy aims. Right? So if we think about it in that light, then a positive approach to take is really to think about how we can implement this in the most effective fashion. Right? My work, you can find it in the Washington Post, looked at how we categorize friends, because it turns out that friends in the context of the UN, as many have alluded to, it's a very difficult concept to pin down. So Palau was already mentioned. Other countries like the Federated States of Micronesia, Kiribati, Tuvalu, those are our friends at the UN. At the very least, those are our developing country friends. The vast majority of countries that vote with the United States in the UN General Assembly at least 25% of the time. So 1 out of every 4 votes, if we set that as the bar for who is our friend at the UN, the vast majority of those countries are developed Western nations like Spain and France and Germany and Canada and Australia and Israel, not countries that are recipients of our foreign assistance. Right? So when we look at the data, and you can all find this data because of Congress, it's required, it's public. There are data sets that you can download. My colleague Eric Voden has made a really handy app that can do data visualizations of all of it. When you look at this publicly available data, right, we see that the vast majority of states actually are very against US positions when we have these salient votes. Excuse me. This is particularly true when it's a resolution that the United States is voting against. So those no votes, as was the Jerusalem vote, are especially salient to the United States. And I think that's important to remember. But the idea of crafting a policy that we can implement around this issue is very complicated. So if we take it to be one of many considerations that the United States must take into account, we need to weigh it against other strategic objectives, other political objectives. And so some of the work that I've done at the American Enterprise Institute is to lay out the complexities of making those decisions. So, for example, if we take a country like Bangladesh, since 2001, Bangladesh has voted with the United States at the UN General Assembly 12% of the time. Bangladesh receives very little foreign assistance from the United States compared with comparable countries. Its neighbor Pakistan votes with the United States at the UN General Assembly 11% of the time, but receives manifold times more foreign assistance from the United States for strategic reasons, for security reasons, for political reasons, right? And yet, right now, Bangladesh is facing a crisis with the influx of Rohingya refugees that have resulted from political decisions made by the Burmese government. Right? So what do you do facing this very real current crisis, a refugee crisis that all of us want to respond positively to? How should that factor in to foreign assistance to Bangladesh? And I think that this is something that we all, as scholars and as experienced officials, need to weigh in on how we can create appropriate strategies so that we're responding effectively while also taking in broader considerations to heart. Sorry, it's allergy season, I apologize. Right, so what I argue is that we need to focus on encouraging greater cooperation. Right? And I'm happy to report that, at least from my sources, Bangladesh really has increased its cooperation with the US delegation at the UN, despite the fact that the Prime Minister of Bangladesh called for all Muslims to unite in opposition against moving the US embassy to Jerusalem. Right? So we have countries that make very bold statements against what the United States has abundantly made clear are its national priorities, national interests, right? And yet we are still willing to work with those countries. And I think that this idea of linking US foreign aid to UN votes has oftentimes been characterized as if we're going to blacklist countries, right? We're not going to cooperate with them, we're not going to give them any aid. And that's fundamentally untrue, right? And so my push really is for us to look at what can be done within the context of existing foreign aid programs, what can be done to incentivize cooperation, and yes, when necessary, if necessary, how foreign aid can be used as a sanction for political behavior that's not supportive of our national security interests. But this is nothing new, right? Scholars have looked at this issue for decades. They have looked at the relationship between US foreign aid and UN voting for decades. They have looked at the relationship between US foreign aid and rotating seats on the UN Security Council for decades. This is not a new issue. And I think the fact that we are struggling with it even now, it's somewhat surprising to me. Because of course, we care about the United Nations. And I think that this is a signal that the United States continues to care about the United Nations in spite of the fact that only 34% of Americans will say that they think the United Nations is doing a good job in preserving peace and stability in the world, in spite of the fact that only 43% of Republican voters say that they support the United Nations. I think this pitch for integrating the United Nations more concretely into US foreign aid policy is actually an American argument in favor of the continued relevance of the United Nations in our foreign policy.
Great, thanks. So Sarah, let me press you on a couple of specific things and then whatever general reactions you have at this point too. But we've been talking very generally about UN votes. I wonder if you can help us from the research understand, I mean, how many specific issues are we really talking about? I mean, is that something you can measure on one hand, two hands? Is it a wide range of votes? Is it always country specific? Are there other issues that are salient? So there's that question. And then I do also want to, you can help kick us off, sort of shifting the lens squarely to the development policy aspect of this, because we've essentially been having a conversation around whether this is effective foreign policy. But we should recognize that the instrument we're talking about is assistance, which clearly has implications for how assistance is done, how it can be effective. Chris raised sort of fundamental questions about the quality of our assistance today and whether it is adapted effectively or not. It wasn't a whether for you, it has not adapted effectively. So maybe you can help us a little bit. I know you've addressed both of those issues in the paper you did.
Sure. So I think Ashiba alluded to this in some of her remarks as well. But when you're looking at the span of what the UN General Assembly is voting on, they do get like 90, 100 so votes a year. Only a small subset of those are those that the U.S. considers to be important. And Drew D'Alelio here, our research assistant at CGD, did some good looking into sort of what are these important votes over the last 5 years or so. And as Ashiba mentioned, most of them, over half of them, relate to either the Israel-Palestine question or weapons of mass destruction. And then there are sort of a scattering of other issues among them, most of which are country-specific, relating to Syria, relating to Cuba, et cetera. So there aren't really a lot of sort of core issues that this policy question about tying aid would really apply to if you're thinking about a greater linkage between foreign assistance and how a country votes at the UN General Assembly. On the development effectiveness question, this is an interesting question too, and I think that there are a couple of reasons to think about how increasing the political usage of aid has implications for development effectiveness and development results. Now, I want to frame all of this in what everybody else here has already said, which is extremely important, in that we are talking about a relatively limited subset of the foreign assistance budget that would probably be under discussion for withdrawal, as an incentive, if you will, for voting compliance. I think it's very important to acknowledge, again, as everyone else here has basically, is that there's a number of reasons why the U.S. gives foreign assistance. There is every expectation that the U.S. government would continue to give foreign assistance for other reasons that are in their self-interest. But I do think, there's been enough of a change in rhetoric around this particular issue that there can be questions around to what extent would this become a more dominant approach to try to link the portion of aid around which there is more discretion to a country's voting record. And so to think about the sort of the aid effectiveness questions around that smaller portion of aid, I think is still worth discussing. And so there's a couple of things I think that are worth mentioning. And one is around the idea that it has been sort of widely and internationally recognized that donors' failure to provide reasonably consistent and long-term kinds of support to particular objectives has been a contributing factor to why aid has not achieved the results that many hope that it would achieve. This is something that is brought up again and again in things like the Paris Declaration, Busan, et cetera. So I think that if you're thinking about long-term support for long-term development objectives, then a mechanism that is going to turn the tap on and off on the basis of voting behavior could be detrimental to the effects of the aid that those particular investments are trying to make. And not only for the investment that is then turned off, but it could have implications for the effectiveness of past investments in that particular area as well. This is not to say that there aren't going to be reasons that the U.S. government is going to want to curtail aid for a particular reason, but it's just it's something to consider. The other thing that's worth noting, I think, in the aid effectiveness rationale or question, I guess, is that when you end up with a multiplicity of objectives for aid, you can end up with some ambiguity that can be more difficult to think about how to define and understand and track what the results of that aid are. And so, if you have an aid project that is intended to incent policy compliance, but is also an education project or something like that, it's hard to be able to sort of separate the two objectives and understand when to call that particular investment a success. When it encouraged compliance or when it achieved the education goals. And a lot of times the foreign policy goals can be more important than maybe some of the other goals that were tied specifically, the development goals that were tied specifically to that intervention. I think, if you think about the founding of the Millennium Challenge Corporation back in 2004, this was a U.S. government agency that was founded very specifically to try to encapsulate a lot of the sort of aid effectiveness best practices at the time. And one of the things that's important about MCC is that it has a focused singular objective, which is poverty reduction through economic growth. And that was really done out of recognition that for too long, too much money had been poured into fairly poorly designed projects with poorly defined outcomes with correspondingly little understanding of what kind of results that they were getting. And then the idea was that a focused, targeted sort of laser on particular development outcomes was going to enable the agency to pursue those in a more effective and targeted way. If you look back to the 1980s, when this argument for a greater linkage between foreign aid and UN voting was a big issue, was a prominent issue. One of the justifications that was put forward for this rationale was in addition to the ones that Brett so clearly put forth, was the idea that aid isn't really doing much for development anyway, so kind of why not, right? We're not getting anything out of aid. It doesn't work. These countries are still poor, so we may as well just use that as a carrot and a stick approach because at least we get some foreign policy compliance out of it potentially. And so I think there are still some echoes of that today, but I think then there are three things to think about. And so one is the sort of the circularity of an argument like that, and that in some ways it is in fact the political usage of aid that contributes in part to what can make it less effective in achieving its development outcomes. The other point to that is that I think it is a fairly inaccurate broad brush statement to say that aid doesn't work. I think we can absolutely point to demonstrated failures, but there are also a number of successes that we can point to as well when aid has been effective in the area of global health. There's a lot of studies that tie aid to sort of modest increases in growth in countries as well. I think the biggest question is that we still don't really know a lot about what the effectiveness is of aid on development outcomes. But again, just to say that it doesn't matter if this is withdrawn because it doesn't work anyway, I think is potentially misleading. So the last thing I want to mention too, and I think this is related to that, is that there's been a real shift in rationale for why the U.S. government gives aid. And this is actually something that was really been well documented in some good work that was recently put out by Sarah Bermeo of Duke University. But she really goes through explaining that in the 1980s in particular and during the Cold War, aid really was seen as a political tool. This was a tool that was given to countries for political leverage, to keep countries from going into the Soviet sphere of influence. Steve Radelet, formerly at CGD, now at Georgetown, I think once wrote, one of my favorite things he wrote was, no one ever pretended that Mobutu was using the then Zaire is using the money that the U.S. was giving him to educate kids or provide vaccinations. This just wasn't really the goal. I think increasingly, sort of in today's world, there is an increasing recognition that aid is being given in recognition that development outcomes in and of themselves are in the interests of the United States. And again, this is something that the rest of the panelists have alluded to. So, given that, it becomes more important than ever that the tools that we have to make aid effective are paid attention to.
So let's stick with this last point and picking up from the earlier comments, thinking of the competition for votes, essentially, that there's another side. If you're on the U.S. side, or the other side. So who is that other side? And we already heard China. How does this issue look when you start to think about it that way? And so for example, our aid money versus China's development finance money. There's obviously a scale difference there. But then more generally, I think, I'd like to explore what it means to our approach to aid if we are thinking of it as a form of competition and applying it very specifically in this instance to UN votes. Does it work as a matter of foreign policy if, you're sort of sizing up a competitor by how much money you're throwing into the pot? And what does it mean to the way we go about this? Sarah, I think you've already addressed this to some degree, but I wonder if others want to take that on. Brett, you haven't spoken for a while.
I spoke a lot at the beginning, so that's all right. There was a paper by Axel Dreyer that was just released called Apples and Dragon Fruits. Maybe it was a couple years ago, I can't remember. But in there, they took a look at Chinese aid and UN voting. And that study found that on the economic side, the non-concessional aid, meaning investments from state-owned enterprises into commercial enterprises, that was done for commercial reasons for the most part. But the concessional aid, in essence, they're equivalent to official development assistance. That was done very much for political reasons. And they found that a 10% increase in voting coincidence with China in the UN General Assembly resulted in over an 80% increase in the level of their ODA from China. So that's the kind of relationship we're dealing with here in terms of a real competitor. And I take Sarah's point absolutely. We have this multiplicity, this whole panoply of different objectives for our development assistance, our economic assistance, our political aid, for lack of a better word. And I agree that because we have so many different objectives for it, it's very hard to ascertain what it's doing, if it's actually achieving the intended outcomes. This is one of the reasons why Jim Roberts and I at Heritage have advocated for a restructuring of foreign aid to more clearly align the foreign aid programs according to purpose. So you separate out the development part just for development, but you very consciously have a foreign assistance segment that is foreign policy oriented. And make no bones about it, because we are returning, I think, to it's not a Cold War, but it's certainly an adversarial multipolar moment in our relationship with China, wherein we are going to be competing, much like we did with the Soviets, for influence in a number of different countries. And we need to have the tools available to do that. And development assistance probably isn't the best tool for that. We need to have something that's far more explicitly directed by the U.S. government to achieve foreign policy outcomes. And we need to have officials be armed and capable of going into a foreign capital and saying, this is important to us. We're either going to reward you, or if you take a stance against us, there's going to be ramifications for that in our bilateral relationship, including our aid relationship. And should that be the only factor involved in that decision? No, but it certainly should be a factor. And what we're doing is countries for a long time have been treating the UN General Assembly as essentially a penalty-free zone. They don't get that kind of connection between what their actions are in Turtle Bay versus what their actions are in terms of our bilateral relationship, capital to capital. And that needs to change. I also think that this is a very provable phenomenon. You mentioned the impact of, or maybe it was you that mentioned the impact of health assistance. That's something that's very provable, right? In terms of development assistance, it's very muddy. Are you doing it for foreign policy reasons? Are you doing it for economic reasons? Are you building schools? Are you building? You educating kids? Are you building roads. What are you doing, and how does it impact development down the road? That's a very complicated relationship to tease out. In terms of our relationship with other countries and voting in the UN, this is a pretty binary situation. We can go to them and say, here's either money to reward for supporting us or a penalty for not supporting us, and we get to see how that affects their voting in the future. So we can very quickly ascertain whether this is going to be an effective policy or not because of a very simplistic, not simplistic, but a very one-to-one or binary turn on, turn off type of result that either does or does not come about due to our policy decisions. And so I think that it's well worth exploring, and we're going to be either seeing evidence of its effectiveness or not.
I mean, I think, I maybe have a couple of reflections to that. I think one is that we have to remember that there are people on the other end of these decisions. If all we are actually talking about, because I admit that we are probably never talking about security assistance to core allies, but if all we're talking about is really the development slice of the pie, then I think it quickly raises questions of the kind that Sarah and others have put on the table about what is the purpose behind the development aid, and what is decades now of experience on questions of aid effectiveness show us about how you should and shouldn't make decisions around how you spend development dollars. But I would just note that decisions have already been made that are having serious implications from a humanitarian perspective for hundreds of thousands of people throughout the Middle East and in other areas too. And so I think it's always just important to reflect on that it's not just like game theory, right? Like that if we give you more money, you will vote more with us, or if we take away money, you will vote differently on that vote in the future. And again, that's where I come back to this question of sort of how we rack and stack then the importance of any particular UN resolution that we know is going to come up year in, year out in the General Assembly, and we have effectively priced into our operations as a global actor over the years. I think one could say if we wanted to worry about every single resolution that went through ECOSOC and that went through the General Assembly every year, we would be in a very unhappy place, right? And so again, yes, we can classify this small subset as important, and maybe we want to start playing this game a little bit more directly than we have, in the past in terms of holding out this stick. But I would just caution us to be very careful about the potential implications of that, including, by the way, not only because there are people on the other end of those decisions, but also because we have so many additional interests that we will continue to try to want to work through the system in different ways, sometimes at the General Assembly, sometimes in Geneva, sometimes at particular agencies, sometimes in the Security Council. And I think, I expect that you would find that when the U.S. is not doing things like cutting off assistance in response to particular votes, not that we really have a lot of evidence about that, as you've said, but I expect that you would find that we are more likely to get countries to move with us in the directions that we want through the multilateral system if we are seen more or less to be a good actor. And I want to just give one anecdote that I was always very fond of when I was in my assistant secretary position, which is that we were told on numerous occasions by officials in the UN Secretariat that the United States was the only country, the only member state of all the 194 at the UN, that ever went into the Secretariat to argue for a candidate getting a UN job who was a non-American. In other words, every other country in the world only goes in to lobby the UN Secretariat on behalf of nationals of their own country. And the US was the only one that actually just said, in fact, I think, now sometimes we might not have had a candidate in the mix, but actually, we obviously would not argue against our own candidate. But the fact that we actually affirmatively would go in to make the case on the merits for a candidate from another country gave us a certain level of credibility, actually, when we were then going in to argue for US candidates, because we were seen as actually caring about the merits and the experience and the suitability of candidates for particular jobs. And I think that kind of model, actually, you could probably play it out, right? And so we also are broadly known, for example, as being the only country in the UN system that doesn't trade votes. And so basically every other country, even all of the very best actors in the multilateral system do, right? Like, you vote for us to get on this thing, and then we will vote for your candidate, who we admit is horrible, but we will nonetheless vote for them so that we can buy your vote. And also, like, the stories are legion about, in particular contexts of, coming when countries are up for votes for different of these UN bodies, that, you'll go in on the day of the vote, and like some country will have put iPads for everyone, and other countries will have like expensive chocolates, and like the United States, you're lucky if you get like a postcard, like, hey, vote for us. But, it just has shown us over the decades of being like a different kind of actor in the system, and being able to stand on that reputation. And I think we have to understand that over time, that has built up a certain credibility for us that is very important. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're able to sort of persuade countries to vote with us on Israel-Palestine resolutions in the General Assembly when the overwhelming number of countries in that body do not. But it does mean that we are able to move more effectively to build coalitions around other things that we want to get done. And so it's part of that balancing of sort of how important ultimately is this to us, or is just this something that we can weather and withstand in the ways we have throughout the decades, I think. And so, again, I would just caution us. And also, I hope that it's true, sitting where I sit, especially right now, but just in general, as somebody who has traditionally been very, proud of, understandably, of the role that the United States government has played in the humanitarian system over time, including as the largest donor, that this wouldn't impact humanitarian assistance. But I think we are already seeing that it is impacting humanitarian assistance of certain types. And so I wouldn't necessarily hang like everything on that it's just going to be sort of a small swath. And even if you just look at that small swath, who is it going to hit the most? It's going to hit probably the poorest countries around the world. So again, I just think this all gets back to this notion that there are a lot of different things at play here that I think need to be balanced accordingly.
But yeah, I think it's important to remember too, though, that when we're talking about competition with countries like China, particularly at the UN, it's not all about Israel-Palestine, right? It's about core American values, right? Support for democracy. China is not a democracy, right? There have been all of these studies of the relationship between foreign assistance and democracy, right? And study after study has demonstrated that when foreign assistance has a positive effect on democracy is foreign assistance from a democratic donor. That doesn't apply to any of the GCC countries that are donors. That doesn't apply to China. Maybe it loosely applies to emerging donors like India, maybe Turkey on a good day, right? But the United States and its European partners are the leading providers of foreign assistance, and we want them to remain the leading providers of foreign assistance, right? And those values, support for human rights, support for democracy, the understanding that fundamental human freedoms are the core for human development and success and progress, right? They are embedded in our various foreign aid instruments, right? The president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, just refused to reapply for an MCC grant, right? In part because the MCC had criticized the backsliding of rule of law in his country. He rejected EU foreign assistance for the same reasons. So if we're going to say we're not going to compete against China for those countries have an out to let democracy decay, to let human rights decay, because they can go to China for easy money. We don't want to create that situation, and I don't think that that is at all the intention behind this policy, right? This policy is formulated to show support for countries who support important US positions of the United Nations, to maintain the relevance of the United Nations as an international body, right? And to make it clear that you can't equivocate on these issues. You can't decide which donor is going to give you the best deal and vote accordingly. It's either that you stand with the United States and you stand with the values that the United States represents, or there are consequences.
So, I mean, I'm not just, like, I don't know if you think that I'm saying something that's different from that. In fact, what I would say is that it is precisely for those reasons that we want to be able to show up at the table as an actor in good standing, as opposed to withdrawing ourselves in different ways, either because we end up making enemies of countries or because we just withdraw ourselves from bodies like the Human Rights Council and aren't able to go toe-to-toe in the same kinds of ways. And so, but again, I think just it's a nuance between how much are you hanging how much are you hanging an insistence question on a particular vote in the General Assembly. I don't think it's a question about what are the underlying, I think we're all basically in broad agreement about why we would be providing assistance. And I share the same concerns about ceding ground to China and others, both, because they might be able to push more money through to get votes in certain ways, but particularly on those issues where it has been extremely important historically for the United States to be at the table and to be pushing from our side how we would like those discussions to go, whether it's votes in Geneva on human rights issues or otherwise. I think the examples are legion as to why it's crucial for the U.S. to be there, and I worry about the U.S. not being there, for precisely the reasons that it's going to enable China, Russia, and others to step into those spaces and claim a stake there in ways that I think are going to be very antithetical to U.S. interests.
That may be, and I'm not going to go for that fly you put out there on to debate the Human Rights Council right now, but I do want to say, having spent half my career at Wall Street and my other half of my career in government, that development dollars are important, but they are dwarfed by foreign direct investment. And we've touched on that. And I think it was 1980 when foreign direct investment first skyrocketed past development assistance. Development assistance might be $120 billion, whereas in any given year, foreign direct investment is $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. It dipped down only once since 1980, and that was right after the Great Recession, the crisis in around either in 2000, I guess it would have had to have been 2009. And after that, it skyrocketed back up. So there's a big difference between us and China. We go in there and we say, particularly when we're investing in your country now, not USAID or development assistance, but as investors in private enterprise in these countries, we need rule of law. A critical point that you brought up, Jessica. We need rule of law. We need value, because value is why we invest. We want to make value, and we want to make money, because we don't give our money away as investors. We have people whose retirement accounts, public pension plans, union pension plans are depending on us for our acumen of investment ability. And second, I need liquidity. I need to, at some point, exit that investment over a reasonable period of time. There are very, very few people who go into a country and try and focus on rule of law and the creation of value. And the creation of value can encompass these things such as health and clinics and maternal and child clinics within 5 miles of every individual around the world. These are all important things to creating value. And then, of course, liquidity. The United States does it well, and other developed nations do it well, but most particularly, the IFC at the World Bank also does it well. They go in there and there are governance programs to ensure there's proper governance so that these developing nations can partake in that $1.5 trillion. I remember General Obasanjo said to me one time at the United Nations, "I'm sick of development assistance. I want some of that FDA. How do I get that foreign FDI, that foreign direct investment? That's what I want in my country." You're darn right, because it dwarfs everything else. But it's difficult for us when we go in there with an agenda of good governance, whether it's development dollars or it's foreign direct investment. And if and we go in there and we insist on good governance, things like staggered boards, independent audits, anti-corruption and ethics training and things like that, versus China. Does China go in there and say, we want to insist that you have an anti-corruption program in place? It's difficult to go back, Scott, to what we talked about earlier, a competition that we're going on right now. And just to close, there are many fantastic things that the United Nations does, like feeding 100 million kids every morning and preventing pandemic from sweeping across the world, and making sure, which I personally like, the fact that everybody speaks English in every air control tower around the world. You know, it gives me comfort when, as we talked before this, when we're flying in and out of Khartoum or
Kabul.
Kabul, exactly. It's okay to walk away from the Human Rights Council when the Human Rights Council lauds the dictators of the world, such as in Venezuela, or the problems just until recently of denying a arms embargo to the Sudan. Is that my gong? It's okay to walk away from them because the Human Rights Council, in the absence of the United States, is going to do virtually nothing.
Sorry, I know we're up front.
I'm going to give you the last word before we go to the audience.
I have two very quick
All right, you two, very quickly, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to pull together a couple of points from different things that people were saying. And I think, one big question that I think comes to the fore here is the question about carrot versus stick. So right now, the policy proposal that seems to be on the table, at least the one that we hear about right now, is the stick policy. So if you don't vote to support the United States position at the United Nations, we will cut your aid, is what we're hearing. Typically in sort of past studies and past conversations and past research on looking at how the U.S. uses aid to sort of incent voting behavior, you look at both options. And so the things to think about here are, one, with China, right? And so if you look back towards the Cold War, I think that there was sort of the general principle that the U.S. would try to induce with foreign aid compliance, not just of countries that they were trying to change positions of, but also countries that were already aligned with their position, just because they were operating under the assumption that the Soviet Union was pursuing similar practices, right? And so the idea was that to provide additional carrots to countries to come over to their side and support their position, because there was another actor that was seeking to do the same thing. If you are just offering a stick, and you do have another country, as Brett pointed out, China is giving quite a bit more money to countries that vote with its position at the United Nations. If you do have another country that is willing to offer inducements when you are not, that has implications about what you think you're going to get out of that policy, I think. This is especially relevant considering that China takes an opposing position to the U.S. more often than it takes an aligned position with the U.S. at the United Nations. The other relates to the whole question about, should we be using foreign aid to support democratic principles? And as Sheba mentioned, think about the people who are on the other side of this equation. And this is interesting too, because I think, Brett, very early on, you mentioned that this is certainly not anything that's been applied consistently. Yeah. And I think there's every reason to believe that it would not be applied consistently in the future because of sort of the various interests and moving parts there are to why you might be providing aid to different countries. And so one thing to think about is if you look at democracies versus autocracies, for instance. So, all else equal, the United States has a preference for democracies. This is in the mission statement of the State Department, of USA. This is part of the national security strategy to support like-minded democracies, et cetera, which would suggest that if the United States is giving quite a bit of support to an autocratic government, it is doing so because it has other interests in mind, which also suggests then a threat to withdraw aid from that autocratic government is probably less credible and probably not in the interest of the United States if the aid that it's giving is in the strategic interest for another reason. Which would then suggest that countries that are in a relationship with the U.S. more on the basis of being a friendly democracy, the threat to withdraw aid may be more credible for those countries. And the same thing applies to poor countries as well. I think there's a bit of evidence that shows that if you're looking at the carrot versus stick approach, when trying to induce middle-income countries, a carrot might be more attractive. And for poorer countries, a stick can work better because they have more to lose. Foreign aid is a much higher percentage of their portfolio of flows. I think Chris rightly mentioned that foreign aid is dwarfed by capital flows, but in some countries, aid is still really a really large percentage of the money that's coming in from industrialized nations. And poorer countries are often less able to retaliate in ways that might be against the U.S. interests as well. And so I think if you're thinking about if it's just the stick tool that's being used, what are the additional implications of that? And I think also it begs the question to some degree, what is the ultimate goal of this policy? Is it actually to achieve foreign policy compliance exclusively? Or is it also, at least in part, a pretext to cut the foreign aid budget, which is something, again, that we've known has come forth as a priority from this administration as well. And so to be able to think about what that means, I think can be important.
Right.
Two very quick things. One, I don't think anybody is talking about trying to influence the broad number of resolutions that come up for vote every year. Every year it's about 250 to 300 resolutions that are passed in the General Assembly. About a third of those come up for a vote. But even among those third, you're really talking about a fairly small subset of resolutions that you would want to really focus on. And so in terms of the overall aid influence and trying to work with other countries, whether they be democratic or not democratic, you're pretty targeted in your approach. Second, I don't think anybody was really talking about the humanitarian budget. Every discussion I've seen about this is talking about either the economic assistance or, and I think that we shouldn't exclude the security assistance. In countries that are not democratic, it may not be the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is the most influential part of that particular government. It may be the Ministry of Defense. And if this is something that rises to the level where the United States really does value it, then that should be something that should be part of the equation. But it's a decision that the administration is going to have to make, and that's all going to be part of this deliberation. Is this resolution, does it rise to the level where the United States wants to intervene in this way? And if so, to what extent? And that's going to be something that the executive branch is probably going to have to handle at very high levels. But at the margins, I think that to the extent that you can provide the authority for the ambassador up in New York to be either to provide either carrots or sticks in terms of plussing up 5% or subtracting 5% at the margins, I think you would be surprised at how effective that might be once the capitals get involved and they know that a particular resolution might impact them in that, even at the margins like that.
Okay, so we have time for a lightning round, I think. I'm going to collect, we'll try 3 questions. We'll collect the questions and see if we can get through them. So I see a couple of hands in the middle. The mics will come to you. All right, so these 2 here, and then just 1 here. 3 exactly, perfect.
All right. Hi, Abik Pramanik, U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. So the question I have is sort of about the implementation of this policy in authoritarian countries, those countries that may oppose us. More often than not, when we give aid to foreign countries like Sudan, Sri Lanka, Stephen Dietrich has a really good article a couple of years ago now examining U.S. foreign assistance in those countries is not bilateral directly from government to government. More often than not, it's implemented through an NGO like CARE, Save the Children, World Vision, and those sort of organizations. Or it also goes to civil society. So if we're doing democracy assistance, we're not going to give it directly to a government. How do you use that as a leverage, carrot, stick, if the government knows the assistance is not really for them and it's sort of opposed to them? If you have an autocratic government, they know if you're giving it to civil society, you want to take down that government in the long run. So I'm wondering how that policy works in practice and some of the governments that might oppose us at the United Nations, at the General Assembly, but also oppose us to U.S. foreign policy in general.
Okay, interesting question right here.
Hi, Jordy Hannon, Better World Campaign. I just had a couple points our organization works to highlight the role.
Sorry, lightning round is questions. You got to get to the question.
Okay, quickly then. Just a couple things, just because it's relevant. It was painted here that kind of most of the votes at the UN are against the U.S. I just think it's important to highlight that 84% of votes countries are in support of the U.S. position, and on recorded votes, it's 55%. So that is the highest ever. I think that's just important because it made it sound like countries were not particularly voting for the U.S. And then just one other point, which gets to the question. We've been talking a little bit about kind of in theory here, but in practice, this has been put in place in terms of UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency. So there was the decision to move the embassy. There was a vote then in the General Assembly, and then afterwards, the Trump administration didn't punish a country, but punished UNRWA. So the majority of their funding is humanitarian assistance, so that's 700,000 kids, 142 clinics, which are set to close in a month if that funding isn't restored. So I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about, we are about to see very shortly this put into practice and what could be some of the implications of that. Thanks.
Okay. and over here in the corner. Right, there you go.
Excuse me. Eric Lee, Georgetown Global Health Security Center. No preface, just a question. To what extent has there been research done, and this may be just a total layup, to what extent is there research on voting patterns in other international organizations, other UN subsidiary agencies, I don't know, the World Health Organization, the ILO, other non-UN organizations? Is there any research on that? And has there ever been a similar policy track record of trying to change the trajectory of aid in accordance with those voting patterns?
Okay, that's what we're going to have time for, so I'm just going to turn it over to our panelists to respond to any or all of those, each of you. Why don't we start at the far end? Chris, please.
I'm going to take the layup over to Eric and just say, we didn't collude beforehand. Eric, when I was at the United Nations, we did a study of the governance of the different pieces of the United Nations, and you mentioned, for example, the World Health Organization. World Health Organization works incredibly well because they have an executive committee, and the executive committee of maybe 30 people come together once a year for 3 days, and they pass the budget and they approve the programs they're going to go after, and they go over and they implement, which is why World Health Organization is such a critical component of international organizations around the world. And again, you know, if there's a chance for world destruction out there, let me tell you, it's going to begin with a pandemic and H7N9 or H1N1 or one of these. So you have to answer your question, Eric, you have to look at the governance structure of these organizations. It's not an apples to apples comparison here. Some of the United Nations pieces work incredibly well, and as such, and I think my old colleague Antonio Guterres is trying to address this, is how do we streamline the bureaucracy of the United Nations to make it more effective and efficient, or, in another expression, faster, better, cheaper.
Thank you. Sheba.
So, I mean, I think in some interesting way these questions are all linked to each other because I think they do very much get at the actual implications of an implementation of this. It was, in fact, the unrefunding that I was referencing earlier when I said it was my understanding that it was already having humanitarian implications and potentially incredibly dire ones. I think it's important to remember also that even in an agency like the WHO, there is both what happens in the governing councils, which there are of all of the big agencies, and also resolutions. And we have also a salient case recently of the World Health Assembly in which the United States tried to use the threat of the withdrawal of aid to kill a resolution that it didn't like. And that ultimately didn't succeed because Russia came in to save the resolution. And so, again, just to remember that it goes on in both ways. I mean, even in my time when we were still a member of UNESCO, when we hadn't fully withdrawn, but we were a member of the executive committee and we ran for re-election to the executive committee, even though we had not been funding UNESCO for many years and we had lost our vote in the General Assembly there, but precisely because we felt it was important to retain a seat in the executive council and to be able to push on budget and other things. And I think it's your question about NGOs. I mean, I would take issue with the notion that that civil society is always in a place to overthrow the government ultimately, because often we are there actually just to try to help people who are in dire need, and different parts of civil society play different roles. But often the implications of an aid cutoff are going to be felt in the having to close off of, for example, programs and operations of NGOs in a particular country, depending on how aid is flowing from the U.S. government in any particular case.
Sarah.
So to respond to your question about have there been studies about voting behavior in other organizations, the one I know of is the Security Council, and again, this is UN too, but what they do suggest is that there are a number of permanent members of the Security Council, and there are countries that come on and off, and there have been associations that have been shown with increased US aid to countries as they come on to the Security Council that then goes away after they rotate off. And this effect is even greater in years where there are particularly important policy issues at play. To comment on Jordy's point about the, how do you measure alignment in the UN General Assembly, I think this is a call to action in some ways to people who are reading these data to be smart consumers of the points that are put forth in various fora about what this percentage is. There's a lot of different ways you can look at it. So the question is, are you looking at consensus votes, bike day? Are you looking at all votes? Are you looking at just important votes? How are you counting abstentions and absences? Are you counting them, discounting them, counting them by half? So all these things make a difference for the final number that you're going to put forth. And so, as this is something that's talked about, in public fora too, it is very important to be sort of a smart consumer of the data that's put forth, so you can understand very carefully what you're reading, how that compares to what you've read in the past, et cetera.
Great.
Sure. She stole my Security Council thing. I was going to say that too. But she did a great job. In terms of the voting in the General Assembly, I think I've been pretty clear that about 2/3 of the votes every year, or the resolutions, are passed by consensus in the UN General Assembly, and that the votes are about 1/3 of those resolutions. There are a couple different problems about counting the consensus resolutions in there. First of all, there's no vote, so you actually don't know which countries are there. What the U.S. has done historically is extrapolate based off of previous attendance in other votes. And so you're essentially creating data rather than actually reporting data in the consensus situation. Also, the consensus doesn't tell you very much, because this is, after all, a UN voting report. So what we're really looking to try to figure out is the coincidence with the United States. How many countries are agreeing with us on what particular resolutions, how often? That tells you something. That tells you something about their policy positions. That tells you something about which countries we need to work with more to address various issues. The consensus resolutions generally don't. And not to say that all of them are irrelevant, many of them are, but not all of them. But a lot of times those resolutions, such as budget resolutions, are hashed out in the Fifth Committee or other areas. And so they end up getting resolved before they actually get to the plenary. So I think that the voting report is appropriate to focus on the actual votes themselves. It tells you a lot more in terms of where countries stand vis-a-vis the United States. In terms of the aid question, if the United States is actually trying to encourage the overthrow of a government, I'm not sure that we're going to be terribly effective in getting them to vote with us in the General Assembly. But I'm open to suggestions if you think that is an area that we could go into. I think what we're really looking at in terms of the shift is moving countries from a no vote to an abstention, so you get the change in the dynamic of the overall resulting vote, or possibly even victory on a much shorter number of countries that actually register a vote. You're working with the murky middle in that area. You're not going to work with the hardcore adversaries of the United States, and the friendly countries are with us most of the time anyway. And so it's that dynamic, trying to take advantage of a more malleable middle set of countries that you're seeking to shift in terms of practices in the General Assembly.
Jessica, you get the last word.
Excellent. So I will have two short points since it's over. First, the United States does cut off foreign assistance, right? The Trump administration cut off part of its foreign assistance to Cambodia in response to blatantly fraudulent elections, right, that undermined the will of the people of Cambodia. So this is something we do. The issues vary across countries. The amount of aid that is withheld varies. It has been common practice for the United States to use its aid to assert its values and for political leverage. On the UNRWA question, I mean, that is a narrative. That's a narrative that the administration has responded to and refuted, but it's a narrative that exists. I would say that there has been a false equivalence that dollars spent on humanitarian assistance equals effectiveness. So for example, we saw earlier this year that all of the refugees in a Ugandan camp had to re-register with the UNHCR because of credible allegations that the Ugandan government was inflating those numbers in order to pocket additional funds, right? So I think the question is, if we're talking about who is on the receiving end of this, that ultimately it's not about dollars given, it's about the quality of services that these organizations can deliver and the amount of people's lives that they can affect positively, and that by looking at spending levels, we're not necessarily getting any useful information about that.
Okay, we're over our time, so please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you, guys.